On July 15, 1970, Leon Mercer Jordan was shot and killed in front of his nightclub, the Green Duck Tavern. Leon Jordan was born on May 6, 1905 in Kansas City, Missouri to Leon Hart and Lena Jordan. After graduating from Lincoln High School, he enrolled at Washburn College in Topeka, Kansas, where he met Orchid Irene Ramsey.
They met over Leon's invitation to buy her an ice cream cone at a playground in Topeka, working as a playground director and going to school. And he met Orchid there. That was the first time they met, and they established a kind of relationship and correspondence. He joined her then in Wilberforce 2 years later, and they continued their relationship and eventually married. When he came back to Kansas City after graduating from college, it was the worst of the Depression. His father was known to Pendergast, who controlled the police force at that time, and who probably interviewed Leon, although I'm not absolutely certain of that. But the Pendergast control of the police force and the politics of Kansas City was under siege. And in 1938, Pendergast fell. But Leon's record was clean enough so that he survived that account. And then he partnered with Earl Warren as a detective. And he and Earl Warren developed a considerable reputation as a very effective detective team. They attracted national attention, and there are several cases in which they succeeded, and he got commendation for that work.
I was introduced to him, and of course he told me about the police department, about the racism when he was on the department. It had changed a little bit, but not much. And so I eventually, talked to some other folks, decided to join the police department. After that, he and I became very close. I often met with him there at the Green Duck and his office there, and he was telling me the good, the bad, and the ugly further, and I was telling him some of my experiences after I got there. And we kept in close contact with each other until just a few days before his assassination.
He had I would say a short career, but a notable career in the police department. And he decided to leave, take an extended leave of absence when he was appointed to help lead or organize the police force in Liberia.
He was afraid of flying when he first went to Liberia. He decided he had to overcome that fear. And when he came back to Kansas City on visits, he had leave from the Kansas City Police Department all this time. And they supported him going over, and he got training in flight program. So he got his pilot license in Kansas City. When he went back to Liberia, they bought him a plane, and he became a flying demon. Leon introduced that into the police activities in Liberia and trained other Liberian pilots to fly. There was a celebration of a big celebration in Liberia in which foreign visitors were coming as guests, and there was a French delegation that was on its way to this big anniversary that went down near a river just inside the boundaries of Liberia. And Leon was charged with organizing a rescue team to go and bring these people back to the capital. And he did that. When he got back, he was given a commendation by the Liberian government, and he was later given a medal by the French government for the rescue work that he had done. So he early achieved a kind of fame.
And then when he came back, he was offered a lieutenant, but at the Floor Avenue station, which is over 22nd floor.
And when Leon reported to that station, he found he was doing the same work that he had done as a sergeant before.
He could only be over black officers, and apparently they was going to make it a black station.
The new police chief was clearly didn't know what to do with this guy, you know, whose training and experience now probably exceeded his own in many ways.
And so once he realized that hey, you know, this is not going anywhere, I got all the experience, I need to organize my own police department, and coming back here, he didn't find that measure of success, so he found out that, you know, maybe I want to do something else.
But he went back to Liberia then for 2 more years and had to decide for himself what was he going to do with his life.
And that's when he decided to enter into politics.
The rest of it's kind of history.
Leon Jordan and Orchid were friends of the Hughes family. Now, I have to say here that a lot of their talk was after the Green Duck had closed, the restaurant tavern, and that was about 1:30 a.m. and our phone would ring. I was always she who answered, and it was Leon asking to talk to Leonard. And they talked and they talked, and as I said, a number of nights, and then they were able to meet face to face. And Leonard was who suggested to Leon, why don't we call that organization Freedom? And Leonard was willing to have it incorporated. In fact, he signed the incorporation papers. And so Leon then said, all right, we will actually form an organization. And so he looked for and found a woman and 5 other men who would form and found that organization. And by the 1960s, Freedom Incorporated was a real live entity.
Part of that was Leon's upbringing from his grandfather to his father, and the roles that they played similar by being outspoken to being champion of the civil rights causes in that time period.
Leon was elected as the 14th Ward committeeman and Rosemary Lowe as the 14th Ward committee woman.
But they also picked up the 17th Ward committee man and committee woman. So they had 2 now, and very strong in the other wards. And so every 2 years, Freedom picked up more and more wards.
And then Freedom came into being, and it won to the extent that he wrestled the power away from the person who controlled the black vote in the 14th Ward.
And so when there were elections, people, political groups, political leaders felt that that was one way contacting Leon Jordan, who by then was a very well-known and powerful black leader, politically strong.
In 1970, Leon Jordan was challenged for a seat in the Missouri House of Representatives by Lee Bohannon.
Lee was part of a group called SAC 20, Social Action Committee of 20. They operated some operations on 27th and Prospect, bookstores, other operations, part of Bernard Powell and that black, I'd say the black militant movement. They weren't part of the Panthers, but they were something similar to that. And Leon had risen to some notoriety in the community because of his role in the uprising in '68. And Lee had decided that they wanted to some new blood in the system, in the political system. So he decided to run against Leon, which was kind of almost unheard of.
And I think, Emil, I believe that maybe part of what we're talking about right now is the first time not only the story ever been told, but the first time the question was ever asked. I never heard anybody talk about it before. Leon was extremely supportive of the work that we did. Now, I don't know that from his public statements or from somebody coming to me and telling me, hey man, Leon, no, I know that from him saying that young people need to be involved. But what he said was, you need to support me. And he was very honest about it.
It was just very well known in the community when you talked about electing people for political office. If the name Leon Jordan was mentioned, it convinced a number of people. Leon is showing us how these things can be done, so let's do it. And he had the actual office, the Freedom Office, in his building where the restaurant was.
I lived upstairs, the second floor of the building, the Green Duck building. He let me live up there.
The Green Duck was at 26th and Prospect, and we're at 27th and Prospect. And we would admire all of the people that we would see going and coming from not the Green Duck, but to Leon's office. And Bernard was a very aggressive young man, very, very smart, and he was like, y'all need to be keeping an eye on. Can you imagine if we had all those people that's going to Leon Jordan's office, if they was coming to our office, you imagine what we could do? So we admired him from a block away, from a distance.
Once Leon became established as a political giant, a titan in the community, even in the state, people like Warren Hearns, who ran for governor, anybody who was anybody met Leon at the Green Duck Lounge, at the Green Duck Tavern, to talk politics, to get his approval. He was more or less the godfather of the black community, and so they needed his permission to do certain things.
Literally, there were people that were from the presidential candidates. They would have, matter of fact, any of the national people that needed to have the strength of the votes, they would visit Leon because he was the head of Freedom, which was the strongest black organization really in America at that time. And they would come, and when we would hear on the news, you'd hear on the news about somebody coming to Kansas City looking for votes, we would know that they're going to end up at the Green Duck. We picked up a lot of understanding about who was actually making things happen, because Leon was a guy that was making it happen.
Yeah, I used to say when E.F. Hutton speaks that folks listen. I think those folks who were around Leon, who were also starters of Freedom Recovery, there was no infighting to the best of my knowledge. And I was young, but I knew all of them. Infighting in terms of, well, he doesn't represent us and the community. I think it would be difficult at that time, in his day and time, for you to find folks out there to say, well, Freedom doesn't represent me. Leon, when he speaks, does not represent me. And I think that Bruce and others who were part of that gave him that when Leon speaks, he speaks for freedom. When Leon speaks, he speaks for the African American community. And that may be difficult to do today.
Leon wanted us to know that we couldn't win. That he was. I personally only met him like 3 different times in short meetings. I never had meals with him. We never broke bread together. We never went to church together. But he admired the work that we did, and he wanted us to know that we couldn't win. So he shared with us the political machine that was there. These are the precincts we have. This is how I ran against McKinley Neal and beat the heck out of him. Here's how I ran against Satchel Paige and beat the heck out of him. And here's how I'm gonna run against you and beat you.
Leon Jordan had many adversaries. One of them was Missouri State Representative Frank Mazuka.
Mazuka had called a meeting in Jefferson City about the Kansas City Police Department. Leon attended the meeting and raised some questions about the discrimination and segregation in the police department. And Mazuka was indignant, and he then put Cliff Warren on the stand and questioned him about whether there was racism in the Kansas City Police Department, which put Warren right on the spot. And so Warren evaded him as best he could. When that session ended, Leon was enraged at what Mazuka had done, and he confronted Mazuka.
I understand that their kissing made up, as figuratively speaking, but at the same time, Leon was arrogant with his power, and when you're in control, you can be arrogant.
Sentimano, who was a low-grade mafia, northeastern mafia person, was outraged at what Leon had done and wanted Leon killed right then, and literally tried to get the mafia bosses to take care of Leon for this outrageous behavior.
He went to Nick Savella, talked to Nick on the back of his porch in his house up north, and asked for permission to do away with Leon. And initially, from what we understand from the research that we did, that Nick did not approve the initial request to kill Leon Jordan because he felt that Leon was too valuable towards their interests in the black community. So Joe had to walk away from that.
But I know at the time that I talked with him, you know, you could tell that, listen, we've got something going here. We need to keep it going. But he was arrogant, and sometimes that's necessary to adversaries.
Tom was aware of something because he said he was sort of providing security service. Tom Neely was providing security service for Leon and trying to protect him.
When you began to deal with folks' money, then especially in that fashion, politically, because he had not only political clout that he was snatching away, but also that they have a free ride. They use black folks to be the doorman and the convener of a gambling house, or the ones. But the fencing was done by those folks who had taverns and not taverns, but certain businesses that did the fencing. You steal something, you take to them, and you know who they were and who controlled it. And the same thing was around the politics. You know who to go to, and when it was no longer the white bosses, then you had to come to Leon and other members of Freedom who turned that effort down.
Years later, when another incident happened where Doc Dearborn was having legal trouble, they asked Leon if he could curry some favor within the legal system to give Doc Dearborn a break. By then, Leon said, I don't want to be a part of that, I'm done with that, and he did not extend that favor. And as a result, he began to come, I guess, more or less sideways with the organized crime operations in Kansas City. Joe went to him again and asked for permission. That's when supposedly Nick gave his blessings to carry out the hit. It was a hot summer night in July. The All-Star game was on TV that night. He was closing up the Green Tavern, and he was going to go home to eat ice cream with his wife. So he was walking to a car, and so as he was getting into his car, another car pulled up. Someone pulled out a shotgun and shot him twice. Drove off. And died there at the scene.
Of course, as soon as I got home, I said, Tom, who do you think did it? And I'm not sure he knew either. These names were floating around, Doc Dearborn and the Willis brothers, and these names were floating around.
Well, there's a lot about that relationship between Doc Dearborn and Leon and other members of the Black Mafia. Doc Dearborn was a brilliant person, and he's the one who was the go-to person who represented the Black Mafia.
I remember the morning that when it came out on the news that it was happening, and I woke up and somebody handed me the paper and said, Leon Jordan murdered last night in front of the Green Duck, and they were looking, had my name, and they were looking to question me. And I'm like, oh my God, this is insane. How in the world could anything like this happen?
Under normal conditions, I would have been walking out that door with him when he closed the door. And if they were going to kill him, they would have probably shot me too as a witness. But he saved my life, probably by sending me back to school. So in fact that his death changed the course of my life.
It was just that the sadness of that, the loss of Leon was what preyed on us.
He made national news when he was assassinated. I guess I was surprised that a state representative would make national news, but he was viewed as more than that, a real important black political leader.
Teenagers Bobby Ramsey and Ronald Winstead told police that they were riding their bikes in the area and had witnessed Leon Jordan's murder. They identified Carlton Miller and Reginald Watson as the killers. The two men were taken into custody and were charged with murder by a grand jury on July 17th.
That evening, I told the prosecutor, Joe Teasdale, Joe, you've got the wrong people in jail.
The two boys' story began to fall apart when they were taken back to the scene of the crime and given lie detector tests. On July 27th, all charges were dropped against Miller and Watson. After Leon Jordan's assassination, Orchid Jordan ran for her husband's seat in the Missouri House of Representatives.
When we look at the numbers that Leon had said that he had beat McKinley Neal and Satcher Page and those guys by, and then bless his heart, once he's gone, his wife come along and beat us with worse numbers. And we were proud of her too. I wasn't no big deal on all of that.
And I don't know if I mentioned anyone that, well, I thought I was supposed to follow Leon Jordan. I said, no, we're going to have Orchid Jordan, his widow, do that, which kind of made sense. You know, no one knew who I was. And so I said, okay, and ran for the city council, and unfortunately I won.
Over the next few decades, Freedom Incorporated continued to win and would eventually become the most powerful black political organization in the state. The murder of Leon Jordan, however, would become a cold case, and for 40 years it remained unsolved until two reporters at the Kansas City Star decided to do their own investigation.
Mike McGraw, who was at the time a longtime reporter, very respected, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter at the Star, had approached me. We had talked about it off and on. He said, hey, I want to do this investigation about Leon Jordan because Mike grew up in Kansas City, so he was familiar with Leon Jordan, and he had a social conscious or social justice side to him, and he was always interested in that. So Mick had approached me. He said, hey, you know Kansas City, you know outside Kansas City, I don't know. Hey, let's work together on this story. And so that year, I think it's 2010, I believe, maybe before that, he approached the editors, he got permission to do that. And so we requested the FBI file. We went through all the archives what the Star had written, because it was a quite extensive amount of material. And so we went through the process of just going through the story, backtracking, interviewing people who was involved. We found out that the weapon that was used to kill Leon Jordan had circulated from this burglary in Independence, got into the fencing operation of the mafia, and somehow or another landed in the hands of the gunman, one of the three gunmen who shot and killed Leon. And once he was taken into custody by the police, decades later, up to the year that we actually reported it, they found the weapon, and it was being used by the police department. It was actually in a squad car, and it was still in use, which is kind of odd that the murder weapon that killed Leon Jordan was back to being used by the police.
It was a horrible situation to happen, and it was even as horrible for 40 years for my children and my family to have to go to school and come home. Daddy, I heard that, and it was a horrible situation that really happened. And when you start hearing about who did it and why it was come from, okay, some black folk did this and some people from the other side of town, and all of that just kept stirring and stirring for year after year. And then God bless Alvin Sykes. Alvin Sykes was the guy that got on top of that and even met the son of the person that was responsible. And they figured out exactly all of how it was, and it just came out publicly within the last 5 years that I or Psych 20 or none of us was anywhere close and had anything to do with that.
After the case was reopened at the request of Alvin Sykes, and I set up a meeting with he and Corin, who was the police chief, and it was reopened, and Sergeant Richard Sharp squad is the one that visited the prison to invite people, to interview people, as well as locally, and came up with the conclusion that these were the three persons responsible for carrying out the wishes of Savella and others.
In 2011, the Jackson County prosecutor closed the case and identified James Doc Dearborn, James Monk Johnson, and Robert Bob Willis as Leon Jordan's killers. All three were members of the Black Mafia.
And believe it or not, Gene Peters Baker, who's the current prosecutor, was a new prosecutor and decided that it was not, and they couldn't present a case to a jury that they felt they could get an acquittal out of because some witnesses were dead or their stories just didn't pan out.
I'm convinced that based on my reading the reports of the police commissioner at the time, shortly after that, well, I think I was a police commissioner, that I'm convinced that they had the right people.
As I said before, I've read the accounts in the Star. They thought they had solved the murder. I'm not convinced that that's true, that they have solved it. But the question is, I think they've solved who the triggermen might have been. But the question is, who put them up to it? I don't think that's been answered yet, at least not to my satisfaction.
The legacy is evident through the number of elected Black officials in Kansas City, not only in Kansas City, but on the county level and on the state level, and even in Washington, D.C. for that matter. I mean, Alan Wheat wouldn't have been the first African-American elected in the 5th Congressional District had it not been for the groundwork or the foundation laid by Leon Jordan. You wouldn't have the level of development that the upper mobility of African-Americans have without Leon Jordan's footprint and them and the shoulders that now many people rest on.